The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Falls when Sheriff Clayton Hargrove adjusted his badge and checked his pocket watch. 7:45 a.m. The town was beginning to stir, shopkeepers sweeping their stoops, the blacksmith's hammer already ringing against steel, and the aroma of fresh bread wafting from Martha's bakery. But Clayton's mind wasn't on the peaceful rhythm of his town. It was on the report that had arrived 3 days ago from the territorial judge. A single woman, living alone in a cabin outside town, raising a child without proper oversight. The law was clear about such situations, especially when concerned citizens had filed complaints. Sheriff? Deputy Tom Brennan approached, his young face creased with uncertainty. "You sure about this? Ruth Caldwell ain't caused no trouble that I know of." Clayton's jaw tightened. At 35, he'd been sheriff of Cedar Falls for 8 years, and he'd learned that the law wasn't always about what felt right. It was about what was right, according to the books. "The judge's orders are clear, Tom. A woman living alone with a child, no husband, no proper family structure. The county has a responsibility to ensure that child is raised in a proper Christian home." The ride to Ruth's cabin took 20 minutes through the scrub brush and rocky terrain that marked the edge of Cedar Falls territory. Clayton had been out here once before, 2 years ago, when old Pete Morrison had reported seeing smoke from what he thought might be an illegal still. Instead, they'd found Ruth Caldwell, a woman of maybe 28 years, tending a small but well-maintained homestead with a vegetable garden that would make any farmer proud. She'd been polite but distant that day, offering them water from her well and answering their questions with careful precision. No, she wasn't brewing liquor. Yes, she had legal claim to the land through inheritance. No, she didn't need any assistance from the town. Clayton remembered being struck by her composure. Most folks got nervous when the law came calling, but Ruth had seemed more wary than afraid, like a mountain cat watching potential threats. Now, as their horses crested the small hill that overlooked her property, Clayton could see why the judge had been concerned. The cabin was small but sturdy, smoke rising from the chimney, and a clothesline stretched between 2 posts, with tiny garments fluttering in the morning breeze. It looked peaceful, even welcoming, but Clayton forced himself to remember his duty. Ruth appeared in the doorway before they'd even dismounted, as if she'd sensed their approach. She was a handsome woman with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a simple brown dress that had seen better days but was clean and well-mended. In her arms, she held a baby, maybe 8 months old from what Clayton could tell. "Sheriff," she said, her voice steady but her green eyes alert, "what brings you out here this morning?" Sir Clayton dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his gun belt, more from habit than expectation of trouble. "Morning, Miss Caldwell. I'm afraid I have official business today." He watched as her arms tightened almost imperceptibly around the child. "What kind of business?" "The territorial judge has received reports about your living situation. Concerns about a child being raised without proper family structure or community oversight." Clayton pulled out the folded paper from his vest pocket. "I have a court order here, authorizing the temporary removal of the minor child to more suitable accommodations until a proper hearing can be arranged." The color drained from Ruth's face, but her voice remained level. "Suitable accommodations? Sheriff, this child is my son, Samuel. I've raised him since birth, loved him, cared for him. He's healthy, happy, and wanting for nothing. Miss Caldwell, I'm sure you've done your best, but the law is clear about children needing proper family structures." "Whose complaint?" Ruth's voice cut through his explanation like a blade. "Who filed these reports?" Clayton hesitated. The complaint had come from Councilman Bernard Whitmore, whose wife ran the Church Ladies' Auxiliary and had strong opinions about moral propriety. But something in Ruth's tone made him uncomfortable about naming names. "That's not important right now. What matters is, it matters to me." Ruth stepped down from her doorway, and Clayton was surprised by how tall she was, nearly his own height, with a bearing that suggested she was accustomed to being taken seriously. You're taking my child based on someone's gossip and assumptions. I think I have the right to know who's making accusations about my fitness as a mother." Deputy Brennan shifted uncomfortably behind Clayton. "Sheriff, maybe we could—" "The decision's been made, Tom." Clayton's voice was firm, but inside he felt an unexpected reluctance. The child in Ruth's arms was clearly well cared for, chubby-cheeked and bright-eyed, wearing clothes that were simple but clean and warm. The cabin behind her, while modest, showed signs of careful maintenance and pride. But the law was the law. And Cedar Falls was a growing town that needed to maintain proper standards if it wanted to attract good families and respectable businesses. "Miss Caldwell, I need you to hand over the child. He'll be placed with a suitable family in town until the judge can review the case properly." "And what family would that be, Sheriff?" Ruth's voice was quiet now, almost dangerously so. "The Whitmores, perhaps. The same people who think a woman can't run a homestead or raise a child without a man's supervision." Clayton blinked. How had she known about the Whitmores? "The placement will be determined by the court. Right now, I need you to comply with this order." He took a step forward, his hand moving to rest on his gun butt, not as a threat, but as a reminder of his authority. Ruth looked down at the baby in her arms, and for the first time Clayton saw her composure crack. She whispered something to the child, pressing her lips to his forehead, and when she looked back up, there were tears in her eyes but steel in her voice. "Sheriff Hargrove," she said, and Clayton was surprised she knew his name. "You're making a mistake, a big one." "Maybe so, but it's not my decision to make. It's the law's." Ruth studied his face for a long moment, and Clayton had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing something he wasn't aware he was showing. Finally, she kissed the baby once more and held him out. "His name is Samuel," she said as Clayton awkwardly took the child. "He's 8 months old. He likes to be sung to when he's fussy, and he's just started eating soft foods. He's never been separated from me before." The baby began to cry as soon as he left his mother's arms, a wailing that seemed to echo across the empty landscape. Clayton felt the sound in his chest like a physical pain, but he forced himself to remain professional. "You'll be notified about the hearing date," he said, raising his voice over the baby's cries. "You can present your case to the judge then." "I will," Ruth said, and there was something in her tone that made Clayton look at her more closely. "You can count on that, Sheriff." As they rode away, Clayton tried to ignore the baby's continued crying and the way Deputy Brennan kept glancing back at the solitary figure standing in front of the cabin. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Ruth Caldwell's final words hadn't been a simple acknowledgement. They'd been a promise. And somehow, he had the unsettling sense that he'd just made an enemy of someone he really didn't want as an enemy. 2 hours after Sheriff Hargrove disappeared over the ridge with her son, Ruth Caldwell sat on her front steps and allowed herself exactly 10 minutes to fall apart. She pressed her face into her hands and sobbed with the raw grief of a mother whose child had been torn from her arms, her whole body shaking with the force of emotions she'd kept carefully controlled during the confrontation. But when those 10 minutes were up, Ruth wiped her face, stood up and walked back into her cabin with the purposeful stride of a woman who had work to do. The interior of the cabin was simple but comfortable. A main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a wood-burning stove, and a small bedroom in the back. But what Sheriff Hargrove hadn't seen, and what Ruth now accessed, was the cellar beneath the kitchen floorboards. She lifted the carefully concealed wooden panel and descended into the space below. The cellar was larger than the cabin's modest size would suggest, carved deep into the rocky soil and reinforced with timber. Along the walls, neatly organized, were supplies that told a different story about Ruth Caldwell than the one the good folks of Cedar Falls had assumed. Medical supplies, bandages, medicines, surgical instruments carefully wrapped in clean cloth. Ammunition for 3 different types of rifles. Preserved foods that could last through a long siege, and in a locked wooden chest wrapped in oiled leather were documents that proved Ruth's true identity. Her real name was Ruth Morningstar, and she'd been born not in some eastern city as people assumed, but in a Cherokee settlement in the Appalachian Mountains. Her mother had been a Cherokee healer named White Dove. Her father, a Scottish trader named Duncan Caldwell, who'd earned the tribe's respect through fair dealing and genuine friendship. Ruth had learned healing arts from her mother and survival skills from both parents, but her real education had come when she was 16, and the tribe faced forced relocation. Rather than endure the march westward, several families had chosen to hide in the mountains, and Ruth's family had helped them establish hidden settlements where they could maintain their traditional ways while avoiding government detection. For 3 years, Ruth had served as a liaison between the hidden Cherokee communities and the scattered white settlers who were sympathetic to their cause. She'd learned to move through hostile territory undetected, to treat gunshot wounds and arrow punctures with equal skill, and to read men's true intentions beneath their polite words. It was during those years that she'd first encountered the Hargrove family. Ruth pulled out a daguerreotype from the document chest, a formal portrait of a woman with kind eyes standing beside a tall, serious-looking man. On the back, in faded ink, was written, Margaret and Thomas Hargrove, 1847. She remembered taking this photograph to Margaret when her husband had been captured by a war party led by rogue Cherokee who'd rejected the peaceful path of the hidden settlements. Thomas Hargrove had been caught stealing horses, or so the war party claimed, but Ruth had investigated and discovered the truth. Thomas had been trying to return horses that had been stolen from Cherokee families by white raiders. He'd been attempting to make things right, but cultural misunderstandings and the volatile atmosphere of the time had turned his good intentions into a potential death sentence. Ruth had risked her own life to negotiate Thomas's release, using her connections with both communities and her reputation as a fair mediator. She'd spent 3 days in tense negotiations, finally securing his freedom in exchange for information about the white raiders who'd been targeting Cherokee settlements. But the story didn't end there. A week after Thomas's release, the white raiders had attacked the settlement where Ruth was staying, seeking revenge for her interference in their activities. Ruth had been wounded in the fighting. A bullet had grazed her shoulder and left her with a scar she still carried. But she'd helped organize the defense that eventually drove off the attackers. It was Thomas Hargrove who'd found her during the battle's aftermath, bleeding and semi-conscious behind an overturned wagon. He'd carried her to safety and tended her wounds while his wife Margaret had nursed her back to health over the following weeks. "You saved my life," Thomas had told her when she was finally strong enough to travel. "I owe you a debt I can never repay." "No debt," Ruth had replied in her careful English. "We help each other. That's how we survive." But Thomas had insisted on giving her something, the deed to a small piece of land he'd claimed in territorial Colorado, far enough from the troubles in the mountains to offer a fresh start. "If you ever need a place to make a new life," he'd said, "this land is yours." Ruth had accepted the gift, but never expected to use it. She'd planned to stay with the Cherokee communities, to continue her work as a healer and mediator. But then the federal troops had arrived with new orders and better tracking methods, and the hidden settlements had been discovered one by one. Her parents had been among those who chose to make the forced march west rather than continue hiding. Ruth had wanted to go with them, but White Dove had taken her daughter's face in her hands and spoken words that Ruth would never forget. "You have gifts that are needed in the world beyond our people," her mother had said. "You can move between worlds, speak languages of the heart that most cannot understand. This is your path, to build bridges where others see only walls." So Ruth had used Thomas Hargrove's gift and traveled to Colorado, taking her mother's maiden name of Caldwell, to avoid the prejudice that came with Cherokee heritage in most frontier towns. She'd built her cabin on the land Thomas had given her, using skills learned from both her Cherokee and Scottish family traditions. For 5 years, she'd lived quietly, earning respect among the scattered homesteaders for her medical knowledge and her ability to deliver babies safely. She'd helped negotiate peaceful solutions to boundary disputes, treated injuries from farming accidents and occasional bandit attacks, and slowly built a reputation as someone who could be trusted to keep secrets and heal both bodies and community conflicts. And then she'd met James Whitfield. James had been a cavalry officer passing through with a patrol, wounded in a skirmish with bandits and brought to Ruth by his sergeant, who'd heard about her medical skills. She'd treated his injuries and fallen in love with his gentle humor and his respect for her knowledge and independence. They'd married quietly, without fanfare, and for 8 months Ruth had known happiness she'd never imagined possible. James had understood her need for privacy about her background, had never pressed her for details about her past, and had supported her work as a healer and mediator in their community. Samuel had been conceived during those 8 months of joy. But James had been killed in a flash flood while trying to rescue a family whose wagon had been caught in a swollen river. Ruth had watched from the bank, helpless, as the man she loved disappeared beneath the churning water. His body had never been recovered. She'd given birth to Samuel 3 months later, alone, except for the midwife skills her mother had taught her. And she'd raised him for 8 months in the cabin James had helped her expand, loving him fiercely and finding in his bright eyes and curious nature a reason to keep going, despite her grief. Now, as Ruth sat in her cellar surrounded by the evidence of who she really was, she thought about Sheriff Clayton Hargrove and wondered if he looked anything like his brother Thomas. The same serious demeanor, perhaps. But did he have Thomas's sense of justice, his willingness to look beyond surface appearances to find the truth? She was about to find out. Ruth carefully selected items from her supplies: medical bag, traveling clothes, ammunition, and most importantly, the documents that proved her legal claim to the land and her marriage to James Whitfield. She also took the daguerreotype of Thomas and Margaret Hargrove, and a letter Thomas had written her before she'd left the mountains, thanking her for saving his life and promising that his family would always be in her debt. It was time Sheriff Clayton Hargrove learned exactly who he'd crossed, but first she needed allies, and she knew exactly where to find them. By late afternoon, Ruth had ridden into Cedar Falls on her sturdy mare Juniper, with her medical bag secured to the saddle, and her auburn hair braided in a practical style that would stay neat during a long day. She'd changed into her best dress, navy blue wool with modest trim that conveyed respectability without ostentation, and her bearing was that of a woman with important business to conduct. Her first stop was Dr. Henry Fitzgerald's clinic on Elm Street. Dr. Fitzgerald was a thin, scholarly man in his 50s who'd arrived in Cedar Falls 2 years earlier with excellent credentials from a medical college in Philadelphia and a drinking problem that had cost him his practice back east. The townspeople tolerated his occasional binges because he was the only real doctor within 50 miles. And Ruth had quietly helped him through several difficult cases when his hands had been too shaky to perform delicate procedures. She found him in his office, reading a medical journal and looking blessedly sober. "Ruth!" His face lit up when she entered. "What brings you to town?" "Nothing serious, I hope." "Actually, Henry, I need your help with something very serious indeed." Ruth took the chair across from his desk and explained what had happened that morning. Dr. Fitzgerald's expression grew progressively more outraged as she spoke. "That's preposterous. Samuel is one of the healthiest, happiest babies I've ever examined. And your care of him has been exemplary, better than half the mothers in this town, if I'm being honest." "I need you to be willing to testify to that at the hearing," Ruth said. "As a medical professional, your word will carry weight with the judge." "Of course, absolutely." Fitzgerald stood and began pacing, his agitation evident. "This is ridiculous, Ruth. Everyone knows you're a capable woman. Who could have filed such a complaint?" Ruth hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I believe it was Bernard Whitmore." "Whitmore!" Fitzgerald's voice was sharp with disgust. "That pompous windbag. He's been trying to run this town like his personal kingdom since the day he arrived. His wife's no better, always sticking her nose in other people's business and passing judgment on folks who don't meet her narrow standards. Then you'll help me? I'll do more than that. I'll talk to some of the other businessmen in town, see if I can drum up support for you. There are plenty of folks here who don't appreciate the Whitmores meddling. Ruth's next stop was Martha Henley's bakery. Martha was a widow in her 40s who'd built her business from nothing after her husband died in a mining accident. She was also one of the few women in town who'd been consistently friendly to Ruth during her occasional visits to Cedar Falls. The bakery was warm and fragrant with the smell of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls. Martha looked up from kneading dough when Ruth entered, her round face breaking into a smile. "Ruth, how lovely to see you. How's that precious baby of yours?" "That's what I need to talk to you about, Martha." Ruth explained the situation, watching as Martha's expression shifted from confusion to anger. "They took Samuel?" Martha's voice rose to nearly a shout. "On what grounds? You're a better mother than half the women in this town who spend their days gossiping instead of tending to their children. The complaint alleges that a single woman can't provide proper guidance for a child," Ruth said carefully. Martha snorted. "Proper guidance? Like Councilman Whitmore provides for his own son? That boy's been in trouble with the law 3 times this year, and everyone knows it's because his father's too busy with town politics to pay attention to what the child's actually doing. Would you be willing to testify about my character at the hearing?" "I'll do better than that." Martha wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron with determination. "I'll organize the other businesswomen in town. There are plenty of us who've had to make our own way, and we don't appreciate men making decisions about what women can and can't handle." As Ruth left the bakery, she felt the first stirring of hope she'd experienced since that morning. But her most important stop was still ahead. The Silver Dollar Saloon was not a place respectable women typically visited, but Ruth had learned long ago that information and influence often flowed more freely in establishments where men thought they could speak without social consequences. She tied Juniper to the hitching post and pushed through the batwing doors. The saloon was dimly lit and smelled of whiskey, tobacco, and sawdust. A dozen men were scattered around tables, some playing cards, others nursing drinks and talking in low voices. The conversation stopped when Ruth entered, and every eye in the place turned toward her. "Well, I'll be damned," said a gravelly voice from the back corner. "Ruth Caldwell, as I live and breathe. What brings you into this den of iniquity?" "Dick G." The speaker was Jake Morrison, a grizzled prospector in his 60s who'd been one of Ruth's first patients when she'd arrived in the territory. She'd treated him for a severe infection after a mining accident had crushed his hand, and her skilled care had saved not only the hand but probably his life. "Hello, Jake," Ruth said, walking calmly to his table. "I need to talk to you and some of the other men here. It's important." Jake gestured to an empty chair. "Sit yourself down, then. Boys," he called to the room, "gather round. Miss Ruth's got something to say." As Ruth explained what had happened, she watched the faces of the men around her grow increasingly grim. These weren't refined gentlemen worried about social propriety. They were working men who understood the harsh realities of frontier life and respected competence over convention. "That's a load of horse shit," growled Pete Williams, a ranch foreman who'd brought Ruth several injured cowboys over the years. "Begging your pardon for the language, Miss Ruth, but that's exactly what it is. You've patched up half the men in this room at one time or another, and you've never asked for anything but fair payment." "More than that," added Sam Torres, a Mexican vaquero whose broken leg Ruth had set so skillfully that he'd never even developed a limp. "You helped my Maria when she was having trouble with her pregnancy. Rode out in a snowstorm to tend to her and probably saved both her and the baby." Jake Morrison leaned back in his chair, his weathered face thoughtful. "Ruth, I'm going to ask you something, and I want a straight answer. Is there more to this story than you're telling us? Because what happened today doesn't make sense unless someone's got a specific grudge against you." Ruth met his eyes steadily. "There are things about my past that some people might not approve of if they knew, but nothing that affects my ability to be a good mother to Samuel. Fair enough, Jake nodded. Your business is your business. But I'll tell you what, if they want to take on Ruth Caldwell, they're going to have to go through us first. A murmur of agreement rose from the gathered men, and Ruth felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the whiskey-scented air of the saloon. These rough, honest men were offering her their loyalty based on her actions, not her background or social standing. There's something else, she said. I have reason to believe Sheriff Hargrove might be more reasonable than he appeared today if he understood the full situation. His family owes me a debt from years ago, though he doesn't know it yet. Jake's eyebrows rose. You know the Hargroves? I knew his brother Thomas and his wife Margaret back in Tennessee. They were good people. Thomas Hargrove. Pete Williams leaned forward. Clayton's mentioned his brother a few times, said he was killed in some kind of Indian trouble back east. He wasn't killed, Ruth said quietly, but he was in serious danger once, and I helped get him out of it. Clayton might be interested to learn the details. The men exchanged glances, and Ruth could see them beginning to understand that there were layers to this situation they hadn't initially grasped. Well then, Jake said, standing up and raising his glass. Sounds like Sheriff Hargrove is about to get an education about who he's dealing with. Boys, I think we need to have ourselves a little talk with His Honor about the importance of looking before you leap. As Ruth left the saloon, she felt the first real confidence she'd experienced since Samuel had been taken from her arms. She had allies now, good people who understood her worth and were willing to stand with her. But more importantly, she had a plan. Tomorrow, she would go to Sheriff Hargrove and reveal the truth about who she was and what his family owed her. She would give him a chance to make things right voluntarily, and if he refused to listen to reason, well then, she would show Clayton Hargrove exactly what kind of woman he'd decided to cross. Sheriff Clayton Hargrove sat in his office the next morning, staring at the baby sleeping in the makeshift crib they'd set up in the corner. Samuel had cried most of the night despite the efforts of Mrs. Whitmore, who'd been selected as his temporary guardian. The child had refused the bottle, had been inconsolable during the evening hours, and had only finally fallen asleep near dawn. Clayton had brought the baby to the office because Mrs. Whitmore had complained of exhaustion and requested relief. Looking at the small, peaceful face, Clayton felt an uncomfortable twist in his stomach. The child was clearly distressed by separation from his mother, and every instinct Clayton had developed as a man who'd helped raise his younger siblings was telling him that this situation was wrong. But the law was the law, and his job was to enforce it, not to question it based on emotional responses. The bell above his office door chimed, and Clayton looked up to see Ruth Caldwell entering. She was dressed in the same navy dress she'd worn yesterday, but today she carried a leather satchel, and her bearing had changed. Where yesterday she'd seemed defensive and desperate, today she appeared calm and purposeful. "Sheriff Hargrove," she said, her voice polite but carrying an undertone of steel. "Thank you for seeing me." "Miss Caldwell." Clayton stood, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun belt. "I should tell you that the baby's placement with the Whitmores is temporary, but non-negotiable until the hearing. I'm not here to make demands about Samuel's immediate return," Ruth said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I'm here to have a conversation about your family." Clayton blinked. "My family?" "Specifically about your brother Thomas and his wife Margaret." Ruth opened her satchel and withdrew the daguerreotype, placing it carefully on Clayton's desk. "I believe you'll find this interesting." Clayton stared at the photograph, his face going pale. It was definitely Thomas and Margaret, taken during the early years of their marriage when they'd lived in Tennessee. But how could Ruth Caldwell possibly have a photograph of his brother and sister-in-law? "Where did you get this?" His voice was sharp with suspicion and something else. Hope, perhaps, that this woman might have information about his brother's fate. "Your brother gave it to me," Ruth said simply, "after I saved his life." The words hit Clayton like a physical blow. He sank back into his chair, staring at Ruth with new eyes. That's impossible. Thomas died in an Indian attack in 1849. His body was never found, but the soldiers said the soldiers were wrong. Ruth's voice was gentle but firm. Thomas wasn't killed in that attack. He was captured, and I negotiated his release. Clayton's hands were shaking as he picked up the photograph. You're saying you were there, in Tennessee? I was born in those mountains, Sheriff. My mother was Cherokee, my father a Scottish trader. I grew up between both worlds, and when tensions escalated, I served as a mediator and healer for several communities. Ruth paused, studying Clayton's face. Your brother was captured because he was trying to return stolen horses to Cherokee families. He was attempting to make peace, not war. But if he survived... Clayton's voice cracked slightly. What happened to him? Where is he now? Ruth's expression softened with genuine sympathy. I'm sorry, Clayton. Thomas died 3 years ago of pneumonia while living in a settlement in New Mexico territory. But he lived, he was happy, and he spoke of you often. He wanted to contact you, but the situation with federal troops and Cherokee communities was too dangerous for him to reveal his survival. Clayton felt tears stinging his eyes. For 6 years he'd carried the guilt of not being there when his brother needed him, the grief of never knowing exactly what had happened. To learn that Thomas had lived, had remembered him, but had been unable to make contact, it was almost too much to process. Why are you telling me this now? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Because yesterday, when you took my son, you told me the law was more important than individual circumstances. Ruth leaned forward, her green eyes intense. But Thomas taught me that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing. Sometimes doing what's right requires looking beyond the rules to see the person underneath. Clayton was quiet for a long moment, processing what he'd learned. When he spoke again, his voice was different, less official, more human. Tell me about him, about Thomas in those last years. Ruth smiled, and for the first time since entering his office, she looked genuinely warm. He became a teacher in the settlement. He said he'd always loved learning, and he wanted to help children, both Cherokee and white, understand each other better. He married a widow named Sarah Running Bear, who had 2 children from her first marriage. He was a good stepfather, patient and kind. That sounds like Thomas, Clayton said softly. He always had a way with children. When we were growing up, he was the one who taught me to read. He was proud of you becoming a sheriff. He said you'd always had a strong sense of right and wrong, even as a boy. Ruth paused. He also said you sometimes let that sense of right and wrong make you stubborn about seeing other perspectives. Clayton looked at her sharply, and Ruth held up a hand. His words, not mine. Though based on yesterday's events, I'd say his assessment was fairly accurate. Despite everything, Clayton felt a small smile tugging at his lips. Thomas never was one to sugarcoat things. No, he wasn't. Ruth reached into her satchel again and withdrew a folded letter. He wrote this for you, about a year before he died. He asked me to deliver it if I ever had the chance. With shaking hands, Clayton took the letter and unfolded it. The handwriting was definitely Thomas's, though age and illness had made it less steady than Clayton remembered. My dear brother Clayton, if you are reading this, it means Ruth Morningstar has found you and chosen to reveal the truth about my survival. I have asked her to do this only if she believed you had become the man I always hoped you would be. I want you to know that my years since leaving Tennessee have been good ones. I have found love again, purpose in teaching, and peace in a community where differences are seen as strengths rather than weaknesses. I think often of our childhood, of the values our parents taught us about treating all people with dignity and respect. I hope that when you read this, you will remember those lessons. The world is changing, Clayton, and the old ways of thinking about race, about women's capabilities, about who deserves respect and protection, those ways are not serving us well. The future belongs to those who can build bridges rather than walls. Ruth Morningstar is one of the finest people I have ever known. She risked her own life to save mine, not because she owed me anything, but because she believed every life has value. She has skills that would benefit any community, wisdom that comes from seeing the world from multiple perspectives, and a heart big enough to love people despite their flaws. If she ever needs your help, I hope you will remember that she gave me the gift of additional years of life, years that allowed me to love and be loved, to contribute something meaningful to the world. Your brother, always, Thomas. Clayton read the letter twice, then set it down carefully on his desk. When he looked up at Ruth, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "He loved you," he said simply, "and I loved him and Margaret like family," Ruth replied. "That's why I'm giving you this chance, Clayton. Thomas believed you were a good man who would do the right thing when presented with all the facts." Clayton glanced toward the corner where Samuel was still sleeping peacefully. "What exactly are you asking of me?" "I'm asking you to really look at the situation instead of just following orders. Come to my cabin, see how I live, talk to people who know me. Make your decision based on evidence, not assumptions." Ruth's voice was steady but passionate. "I'm not asking you to break the law. I'm asking you to investigate thoroughly before you destroy a family based on someone else's prejudices." Clayton was quiet for several minutes, wrestling with conflicting emotions and obligations. Finally, he looked up at Ruth with the expression that was part sheriff, part grieving brother, and part man trying to figure out the right thing to do. "I'll make you a deal," he said. "Give me 3 days to investigate this situation properly. I'll visit your cabin, talk to people who know you, review the actual laws about child custody rather than just following the judge's initial order. And in return, you give me your word that you won't try to take Samuel by force while I'm conducting this investigation." Ruth considered this carefully. "And what happens if your investigation convinces you that I'm a fit mother? Then I'll find a way to make this right, even if it means standing up to the judge and the town council." Ruth studied his face for a long moment, looking for signs of deception or false promises. What she saw was a man struggling with new information that challenged everything he'd thought he knew about his duty and his family's history. "I give you my word," she said finally. "But Clayton, if you're planning to string me along while you figure out how to make this politically convenient for yourself, you should know that I have other options. And you won't like them nearly as much as you'll like cooperating with me." Clayton nodded, recognizing the warning for what it was. "Understood. But Ruth, if I do this investigation and determine that the original decision was correct, you need to accept that outcome. If your investigation is truly fair and thorough, and you still believe Samuel would be better off without me, then I'll accept that judgment." Ruth stood, gathering her satchel. "But I don't think that's what you're going to find." As she moved toward the door, Clayton called after her, "Ruth, thank you for saving Thomas and for bringing me that letter. Regardless of how this situation resolves, I'm grateful to know the truth about what happened to him." Ruth paused at the door, looking back with an expression that was both sad and hopeful. "Thomas would be proud of the man you're becoming, Clayton. Don't let fear of other people's opinions stop you from doing what you know is right." After she left, Clayton sat alone in his office, listening to Samuel's quiet breathing and staring at the photograph of his brother and sister-in-law. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning not just a specific decision, but the entire framework he'd used to make such decisions. Tomorrow, he would begin his investigation, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that by the time it was over, he was going to discover that Ruth Caldwell was far from the only person in Cedar Falls who deserved a second look. Clayton's investigation began at dawn the next day. His first stop was Ruth's cabin, where he arrived to find her tending a small garden behind the house. In the early morning light, the homestead looked even more impressive than it had during his official visit. The vegetable rows were perfectly straight, the cabin's chinking was tight and well-maintained, and a small corral held 2 healthy horses and a milk cow. "Sheriff," Ruth greeted him without surprise, wiping soil from her hands. "Right on time. You were expecting me?" "I've learned to expect thoroughness from Hargrove men," she said with a slight smile. "Come inside. I'll show you how Samuel and I live." The cabin's interior was a revelation. What Clayton had assumed was simple poverty was actually careful organization and considerable skill. The furniture was handmade but expertly crafted. The floors were swept clean, and the walls were lined with shelves holding medical supplies, books, and preserved foods. A rocking chair by the fireplace was worn smooth from use, and beside it sat a basket filled with small toys carved from wood. "You made all of this?" Clayton asked, running his hand along a perfectly joined table edge. "Thomas taught me carpentry during his recovery from the ambush, said every person should know how to build what they need." Ruth opened a chest near the bed, revealing neatly folded baby clothes and blankets. "Samuel's things. I made most of them myself, following patterns my mother taught me." Clayton picked up a tiny shirt, examining the careful stitching and noting the soft quality of the fabric. "This is fine work. I take pride in caring for my son properly." Ruth's voice held a challenge. "Is there anything here that suggests an unfit mother?" Clayton looked around again, this time seeing details he'd missed during his official visit. The cabin was spotlessly clean, well organized, and filled with evidence of loving care for a child. Books on childcare and medicine sat beside volumes of poetry and history. A small writing desk held correspondence with what appeared to be suppliers and fellow medical practitioners. "Show me your medical practice," he said. Ruth led him to the cellar, where Clayton was astonished to find supplies that would rival those of many town doctors. Surgical instruments gleamed in neat rows, medicines were carefully labeled and organized, and detailed case notes were filed in a wooden cabinet. "How did you acquire all this?" Clayton asked, examining a set of surgical tools that would have cost a month's wages. "Some I inherited from my mother, some I earned through my practice, and some were gifts from grateful patients." Ruth pulled out a thick ledger. "I keep detailed records of every patient I treat, including payments received and outstanding debts." Clayton flipped through the ledger, amazed by the careful documentation. Ruth had treated everything from broken bones to difficult births, and her notes showed the methodical thinking of a trained medical practitioner. More importantly, the payment record showed that she charged fair rates and often accepted payment in goods or services from those who couldn't afford cash. "Ruth, this is remarkable. You've essentially been running a medical practice that serves this entire region. Someone has to. Dr. Fitzgerald is skilled when he's sober, but he's not always available, and the nearest other doctor is 2 days' ride away." Ruth closed the ledger. "I've delivered 37 babies in the past 5 years, Clayton. Not one mother or child was lost." "Can the town's medical establishment make that claim?" Clayton knew they couldn't. He'd personally taken part in the burial of 3 mothers and 5 infants who died in childbirth despite Dr. Fitzgerald's care. "Why didn't you tell anyone about your medical background?" Ruth's expression darkened slightly. "Because a woman with Cherokee heritage practicing medicine would be run out of most towns, regardless of her skills. I've learned to let my work speak for itself, rather than relying on credentials that some people would never accept." Clayton felt a flush of shame as he realized the truth in her words. Cedar Falls, for all its growth and ambitions, was still a place where prejudice could override practical considerations. His next stop was the Torres Ranch, where he found Sam Torres mending fence with 2 of his hands. When Clayton explained his purpose, Sam's weather-beaten face split into a grin. "Sheriff, you want to know about Miss Ruth? That woman saved my Maria's life, and probably our baby's too." Sam set down his tools and gestured for Clayton to sit on a nearby stump. Maria had been in labor for 2 days, and the midwife in town said there wasn't nothing more she could do, told me to prepare for the worst. What happened? I rode out to Miss Ruth's place like a madman, even though it was the middle of a snowstorm. She didn't hesitate, just grabbed her bag and followed me back through weather that would have killed most people. Sam's voice grew emotional. She worked with Maria for 6 hours straight, never gave up. Never stopped trying different things. Finally got the baby turned around and delivered safe. "And your wife?" Maria says Miss Ruth was the calmest, most reassuring presence she'd ever experienced. Never showed fear or uncertainty, just confidence and skill. Sam looked directly at Clayton. "Sheriff, I've got 4 children now, and they all love Miss Ruth like a grandmother. She's taught them about plants and healing, told them stories, treated their scrapes and fevers. If someone's questioning her fitness to raise a child, they don't know what they're talking about." Clayton's next interview was with Jake Morrison, who met him at the mining claim where Jake and 2 partners were working a promising silver vein. "Ruth Caldwell." Jake leaned on his shovel and spat into the dirt. "Sheriff, that woman is tougher and more capable than most men I know." "You want to know how I know that?" Clayton nodded. 3 years ago, claim jumpers hit our camp while me and Bill were in town getting supplies. They beat Tom here pretty bad and were planning to take over the whole operation. Jake gestured to his partner, a quiet man with scars across his forehead. Tom managed to get away and made it to Miss Ruth's place. "What did she do?" She patched him up, gave him one of her horses and rode back here with him. But she didn't just tend his wounds. She helped us set up an ambush for when them claim jumpers came back." Jake's grin was fierce. "Sheriff, that woman can shoot better than most soldiers I've known, and she's got a strategic mind that would impress a general. We got our claim back and sent them bastards packing. She fought alongside you." "Damn right she did. And when one of the claim jumpers got hit and was bleeding bad, she insisted on treating his wounds before we ran them off. Said even scoundrels deserve medical care." Jake's expression grew thoughtful. "That's the kind of person she is. Tough enough to fight when necessary, but too decent to let someone suffer if she can help it." By late afternoon, Clayton had interviewed a dozen people throughout the region, and the picture that emerged was consistent and impressive. Ruth Caldwell was respected as a healer, trusted as a mediator, and known for her integrity and practical skills. More than that, she was clearly loved by the children in the families she'd helped. His final stop was the most difficult, a visit to the Whitmore house to check on Samuel's condition. Councilman Bernard Whitmore met him at the door, his round face flushed with irritation. "Sheriff, I hope you're here to tell us this situation is resolved. My wife is exhausted from dealing with that child." "How has Samuel been?" Clayton asked. "Difficult, fussy. Won't take proper feeding, cries constantly, and refuses to settle into civilized routine." Whitmore's voice carried clear frustration. "Frankly, Sheriff, this confirms my suspicions about his upbringing. The child is obviously accustomed to irregular habits and lack of proper discipline." Clayton found Mrs. Whitmore in the sitting room, looking haggard and frustrated, while Samuel wailed in a fancy wooden crib that had been set up near the window. "Mrs. Whitmore, how are you managing?" Eleanor Whitmore looked up with relief. "Oh, Sheriff Hargrove, thank goodness you're here. This child is impossible. He won't eat properly, won't sleep at appropriate times, and cries whenever I try to establish a proper routine." Clayton approached the crib and looked down at Samuel, who was red-faced from crying and clearly distressed. Without thinking, he reached down and picked up the baby, who immediately began to calm slightly at the gentle, confident handling. "When did he last eat?" Clayton asked. "I've been trying to feed him every 4 hours, as is proper for an infant his age," Mrs. Whitmore said. "But he keeps rejecting the formula and trying to suck on his fingers like some kind of savage." Clayton felt a cold anger building in his chest. "Mrs. Whitmore, this child has been breastfed since birth. He doesn't understand bottle feeding, and he's probably hungry and confused. Well, he'll have to learn proper habits. I can't have him disrupting my household with his uncivilized demands." "His uncivilized demands?" Clayton's voice was dangerously quiet. "He's 8 months old, Mrs. Whitmore. He's been separated from his mother for 2 days, placed in a strange environment, and expected to adapt to feeding methods he's never experienced. He's not being difficult. He's being a normal baby in distress." Mrs. Whitmore's face reddened. "Sheriff, I hardly think you're qualified to judge my childcare methods. I've raised 3 children successfully." Clayton looked around the Whitmore sitting room. noting the expensive but cold furnishings, the absence of any toys or child-friendly items except the crib that had been hastily brought in. He thought about Ruth's cabin, with its hand-carved toys, its rocking chair worn smooth from use, its warm and welcoming atmosphere. "Where is your son, Robert, Mrs. Whitmore?" "Robert is—" She hesitated. "Robert is currently away, visiting relatives." Clayton knew that was a lie. Robert Whitmore was currently in the territorial jail in Denver, arrested for his third offense of public drunkenness and disturbing the peace. The Whitmores had shipped him off to avoid local embarrassment, not for a family visit. Looking down at Samuel, who had stopped crying but was still clearly distressed and hungry, Clayton made his decision. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm removing Samuel from your care effective immediately." "What? You can't do that. The judge placed him here specifically." "The judge placed him in temporary care pending investigation. My investigation is complete." Clayton wrapped Samuel more securely in the blanket. "This child is suffering under your care, and I won't allow that to continue." "But where will you take him?" "Back to that woman." Clayton looked at Mrs. Whitmore with an expression that made her step backward. "I'm taking him back to his mother, where he belongs. And Mrs. Whitmore, if you or your husband try to interfere with this decision, you'll discover that I take a very dim view of people who cause unnecessary suffering to children." Udidi. As Clayton walked out of the Whitmore house with Samuel in his arms, he felt lighter than he had in days. The baby seemed to sense the change in situation and had settled into alert but calm observation of his surroundings. It was time to make things right. But first, he had some very serious words to share with Judge Morrison and Councilman Whitmore about the difference between law and justice, a lesson his brother Thomas had apparently been trying to teach him from beyond the grave. The ride to Ruth's cabin took longer than usual because Clayton stopped frequently to check on Samuel, who seemed to brighten with each mile they traveled away from town. By the time they crested the hill overlooking Ruth's homestead, the baby was cooing softly and looking around with bright, curious eyes. Ruth must have heard their approach because she appeared in her doorway before Clayton had even dismounted. For a moment, mother and child simply stared at each other across the distance, and Clayton felt like an intruder witnessing something sacred. "Samuel," Ruth whispered, and the baby's response was immediate. He began making excited sounds and reaching toward his mother with tiny, grasping fingers. Clayton dismounted carefully, mindful of his precious cargo, and walked slowly toward the cabin. "I believe this belongs to you," he said simply. Ruth's composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down her face as she reached for her son, and when Samuel was safely in her arms, the baby immediately settled against her with a contented sigh that seemed to echo across the quiet landscape. "Thank you," Ruth said, her voice thick with emotion. "Clayton, thank you." "I should be thanking you," Clayton replied, "for opening my eyes to what was really happening here." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching Samuel nurse contentedly while Ruth hummed a soft lullaby. Finally, Clayton cleared his throat. "Ruth, I need to tell you what I found during my investigation, and I need to discuss what happens next." "Come inside," Ruth said. "We have a lot to talk about." Once they were settled in Ruth's main room, Samuel finally peaceful in his mother's arms, Clayton began his report. "I spoke with 12 people today. Ranchers, miners, farmers, and townspeople. Every single one of them had nothing but praise for your character, your skills, and your care for children." He paused. "I also discovered some disturbing things about the people who filed the complaint against you." Ruth raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "The Whitmore's own son is currently in jail in Denver for repeated alcohol-related offenses. Mrs. Whitmore was completely incompetent at caring for Samuel. She tried to force him into feeding schedules inappropriate for a breastfed infant and showed no understanding of child development." Clayton's voice grew harder. "More importantly, I discovered that Bernard Whitmore has been pressuring several single women in the territory to sell their land claims to his development company. Women who refuse to sell have mysteriously faced legal challenges to their property rights or their fitness as independent citizens. So this was never really about Samuel's welfare, Ruth said quietly. I don't think so. I think it was about forcing you off land that Whitmore wants for his expansion plans. Clayton leaned forward. Ruth, your property sits right in the path of the proposed railroad route. If Whitmore could acquire it cheaply, he'd make a fortune when the railroad arrives. Ruth was quiet for a moment, gently stroking Samuel's hair. What do you plan to do about this? First, I'm going to make sure the judge understands the real situation. I prepared a detailed report documenting your medical practice, your standing in the community, and the inadequate care Samuel received at the Whitmores. Clayton pulled out a thick folder. I'm also going to request an investigation into Whitmore's pattern of targeting single women landowners. And if the judge refuses to listen, Clayton's expression grew determined, then I'll take it to the territorial governor. What Whitmore is doing isn't just wrong, it's illegal. Using false child welfare claims to pressure property sales is fraud and conspiracy. Ruth studied his face carefully. This could cost you your job, Clayton. Whitmore has influence with the town council and the judge. Maybe. But Thomas taught me that some things are more important than job security. Clayton met her gaze steadily. Besides, I've been thinking about what you said regarding the difference between law and justice. I became a sheriff to protect people, not to help corrupt politicians steal from widows and single mothers. They were interrupted by a knock at the door. Ruth looked surprised. She rarely had visitors, especially in the evening. Clayton stood, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. Expecting anyone? No. Ruth carefully placed Samuel in his basket and moved toward the door. Who is it? It's Dr. Fitzgerald, Ruth, and I've got Jake Morrison, Martha Henley, and about 15 other folks with me. Ruth opened the door to find her front yard filled with people carrying lanterns and wearing expressions of determined support. Dr. Fitzgerald stepped forward, his usually mild manner replaced by fierce resolve. Ruth, we heard what happened with the sheriff taking Samuel back from the Whitmores, he said. We wanted to make sure you knew that the whole community is behind you. Martha Henley pushed forward, carrying a basket that smelled of fresh bread. And we wanted to bring some practical support too. Food, supplies, whatever you need. Jake Morrison's gruff voice carried from the back of the group. Sheriff, we also wanted to have a word with you about this whole situation. Clayton stepped onto the porch, and Ruth was struck by how naturally he positioned himself beside her rather than in opposition. What can I do for you folks? We want to know what you're planning to do about the people who caused this mess, Jake said bluntly. Because if the law ain't gonna take care of Whitmore and his scheming, we might have to handle things ourselves. Now hold on, Clayton said, raising his hands. I understand you're angry, and you have every right to be, but we're going to handle this the right way, through proper legal channels. With respect, Sheriff, said Sam Torres, we've seen how well proper legal channels work when rich folks want something from poor folks. Sometimes, direct action is the only thing people like Whitmore understand. Clayton felt the dangerous mood of the crowd and knew he needed to address it quickly. I hear what you're saying, and I don't blame you for feeling that way, but let me tell you what I'm planning to do, and then you can decide if you think justice will be served. He outlined his investigation findings and his plans to expose Whitmore's fraudulent scheme. As he spoke, Ruth watched the faces of her supporters and saw their anger gradually shift into cautious optimism. Sheriff, Martha Henley said when he finished, that sounds real promising, but what if the judge and the territorial officials are already in Whitmore's pocket? What if they just cover this up? Clayton was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with the question. Finally, he looked directly at Ruth. Then I'll resign my position and help you take this to the federal authorities. And if that doesn't work, he paused, meeting the eyes of the gathered crowd, then I'll stand with you folks in whatever action you decide is necessary to protect this community from corruption. The statement sent a murmur through the crowd, and Ruth felt a surge of surprise and admiration. Clayton Hargrove was committing to fight for justice, even if it meant abandoning his official authority. Dr. Fitzgerald stepped forward and extended his hand to Clayton. "Sheriff, I misjudged you. Any man willing to risk his career to do what's right has my full support." One by one, the other members of the crowd came forward to shake Clayton's hand and express their commitment to supporting both him and Ruth in whatever came next. As the crowd finally began to disperse, carrying their lanterns back into the darkness, Ruth and Clayton found themselves alone on the porch. "You didn't have to do that," Ruth said quietly. "Promise to stand with us, even if it means giving up your badge." Clayton looked out into the night, where the last of the lantern lights were disappearing over the ridge. "Yes, I did. Thomas spent years living between two worlds, trying to build bridges and find peaceful solutions to impossible problems. The least I can do is follow his example. He would be proud of you." "I hope so." Clayton turned toward his horse. "Ruth, I'm going to ride back to town tonight and start preparing the paperwork for the judge. But I want you to know, whatever happens tomorrow, Samuel stays with you. I won't let anyone separate you again." "Clayton." Ruth's voice stopped him as he reached for his horse's reins. "There's something else you should know about your brother." He turned back, and in the lamplight from the cabin, Ruth could see the mix of hope and apprehension in his face. "Thomas talked about you constantly during the months I knew him. He said you were the most naturally honest person he'd ever met, but that you sometimes got so focused on rules that you forgot to look at the people the rules were supposed to protect." Ruth smiled. "He also said that when you finally learned to balance law with justice, you'd be the kind of sheriff that frontier communities desperately needed." Clayton felt tears stinging his eyes for the second time in 2 days. He really said that? He did. And Clayton, he was right. As Clayton rode back toward Cedar Falls under a canopy of stars, he carried with him not just the determination to see justice done, but the knowledge that he was finally becoming the man his brother had always believed he could be. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation with Judge Morrison and the revelation of Whitmore's corruption. But tonight, Ruth Caldwell was home with her son. The community had rallied around truth and justice, and for the first time since taking office, Sheriff Clayton Hargrove felt like he was truly serving and protecting the people who mattered most. Judge Morrison's chambers were cramped and stuffy, filled with the smell of old leather and tobacco smoke. But the tension in the air was sharp enough to cut as Clayton laid out his evidence on the judge's cluttered desk. Samuel slept peacefully in Ruth's arms, while she sat in the single chair facing the judge's bench, her bearing dignified despite the circumstances. "Sheriff Hargrove," Judge Morrison said, his weathered face creased with confusion and growing anger as he reviewed Clayton's documentation. "Are you telling me that Councilman Whitmore filed a fraudulent complaint against Miss Caldwell in order to force her off her land?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you, Your Honor." Clayton handed over another folder. "I've documented a pattern of similar actions against 3 other single women landowners in the territory. In each case, Whitmore's development company acquired their properties at below-market prices after they faced legal challenges to their residency or fitness as independent citizens. Judge Morrison was a fair man who'd earned his position through competence rather than politics, but he was also cautious about making enemies of powerful people. Clayton could see him weighing the evidence against the potential consequences of acting on it. "These are serious allegations, Sheriff. Do you have any direct proof of conspiracy?" Ruth spoke for the first time since entering the chambers. "Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to present some additional evidence." She reached into her satchel and withdrew a packet of letters. "These are correspondence between Councilman Whitmore and a land speculator in Denver. They were delivered to my cabin by mistake 3 weeks ago. The postal rider confused my address with the Whitmore property." Judge Morrison took the letters and read them silently, his expression growing increasingly grim. Finally, he looked up at Ruth. "Miss Caldwell, did you open these letters knowing they were misdirected mail?" I opened the first one before I realized it wasn't intended for me. When I saw the contents, I felt I had an obligation to preserve them as evidence of illegal activity. Ruth's voice was calm and professional. As someone who served as a mediator in legal disputes, I understand the importance of maintaining evidence of fraud and conspiracy. Clayton leaned forward. What do the letters say, Your Honor? They outline a systematic plan to target single women landowners along the proposed railroad route. Whitmore specifically mentions using moral fitness challenges and child welfare complaints to pressure property sales. Judge Morrison set the letters down with visible disgust. Gentlemen and Miss Caldwell, this is conspiracy to commit fraud on a territorial level. The door to the chambers burst open suddenly, and Councilman Whitmore strode in with two of his associates, his face red with indignation. Judge Morrison, I demand to know why this hearing is proceeding without proper notice to all interested parties. Whitmore's voice was loud and aggressive. The child welfare of this community requires... Mr. Whitmore, Judge Morrison's voice cut through the bluster like a knife. You are not a party to this proceeding, and your presence here is inappropriate. I filed the original complaint. I have every right to... You have the right to remain silent while I decide whether to charge you with conspiracy, fraud, and perjury. Judge Morrison stood, his usually mild demeanor replaced by judicial authority. Sheriff Hargrove, I'm ordering you to take Mr. Whitmore into custody pending investigation of these charges. The room erupted in chaos. Whitmore began shouting about his rights and his standing in the community, while his associates backed toward the door. Clayton moved smoothly to block their exit, his hand resting on his gun. Bernard Whitmore, Clayton said formally, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, filing false official reports, and attempted theft by deception. This is outrageous. You can't arrest me based on stolen correspondence and the word of some half-breed woman with questionable... Clayton's voice went deadly quiet. Mr. Whitmore, I strongly advise you to stop talking right now. Ruth stood slowly, shifting Samuel to one arm while facing Whitmore directly. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. Mr. Whitmore, I am a legal landowner, a respected member of this community, and a woman who has never been convicted of any crime or moral failing. I'm also someone who has risked her life repeatedly to serve others, including saving the life of this sheriff's brother during the Cherokee Troubles in Tennessee. She stepped closer to Whitmore, and Clayton noticed that several of the businessmen who'd gathered outside the chambers had moved into the doorway. Most importantly, I am not alone in this fight. Jake Morrison's gruff voice came from the doorway. Judge, we've got about 30 citizens outside who'd like to hear Mr. Whitmore explain his land-grabbing scheme. And I've got medical records documenting Miss Ruth's excellent care for patients throughout this territory, Dr. Fitzgerald added, pushing past Jake, including successful treatments that saved lives when conventional medicine failed. Judge Morrison raised his hand for silence. This is still a court of law, not a town meeting. However, he looked directly at Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, the evidence against you is substantial and credible. Sheriff Hargrove, please escort Mr. Whitmore to the jail while I prepare formal charges. As Clayton placed handcuffs on Whitmore, the councilman made one last desperate attempt. Judge, you're making a mistake. This woman is not what she appears to be. Her background, her connections to savage tribes... Mr. Whitmore, Ruth interrupted calmly, my connections to savage tribes include saving the life of a white settler who was trying to make peace between communities. My medical training includes both Cherokee traditional knowledge and formal education that allows me to serve patients more effectively than most doctors. And my background includes the courage to stand up to men who abuse their power to steal from those they consider beneath them. She turned to Judge Morrison, who, Your Honor, I request that you consider not just the dismissal of charges against me, but also the return of my property deed and formal recognition of my right to continue my medical practice in this territory. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. Miss Caldwell, based on the evidence presented, I'm dismissing all charges against you and formally recognizing your fitness as a parent and as a practicing healer. Furthermore, I'm directing Sheriff Hargrove to investigate Mr. Whitmore's other actions against single women landowners and to prepare charges in those cases as well. D. As Clayton led Whitmore away, the councilman made one final threat. This isn't over, Hargrove. I have connections in Denver, influence with the territorial government. You'll regret crossing me. Clayton paused at the door. Mr. Whitmore, the territorial government is very interested in land fraud schemes that interfere with railroad development. I suspect they'll be more interested in prosecuting you than in helping you. Outside the courthouse, word of the proceedings had spread rapidly through Cedar Falls. A crowd of nearly 50 people had gathered, including many of the ranch families and miners who'd spoken to Clayton during his investigation. When Ruth emerged with Samuel in her arms and Clayton at her side, a cheer went up from the assembled crowd. Martha Henley pushed forward with tears in her eyes. "Ruth, we're so glad this is finally over." "It's more than over," Dr. Fitzgerald announced to the crowd. "Miss Caldwell has been formally recognized by the court as a qualified medical practitioner. This territory now has 2 doctors, and we're damn lucky to have them both." Jake Morrison climbed onto a wagon bed to address the crowd. "Folks, what happened here today proves something important. When good people stand together against corruption and bullying, justice wins, but it also proves we need to be more careful about who we elect to represent us." A voice from the crowd called out, "What about the sheriff? Is Hargrove going to keep his job after going against Whitmore and his cronies?" Clayton stepped forward. "That's up to the people of Cedar Falls to decide. I serve at the pleasure of this community, and if you think I've overstepped my authority, you have the right to replace me." "Hell no!" Sam Torres shouted. "You did exactly what a sheriff should do, protected the innocent and arrested the guilty." The crowd voiced loud agreement, and Clayton felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. For the first time since taking office, he felt like he was truly part of the community he served, rather than just an enforcer of rules they may or may not agree with. As the crowd began to disperse, Ruth found herself standing alone with Clayton beside his horse. Samuel was awake and alert, looking around with bright curiosity at the bustling town square. "So what happens now?" Ruth asked. "Now I finish the investigation into Whitmore's other schemes, make sure justice is served for all his victims." Clayton adjusted his hat against the sun. "And I suppose you go back to your cabin and continue being the best doctor and mother in the territory." Ruth was quiet for a moment, studying his face. "Clayton, there's something I need to ask you." "What's that?" "Your investigation, your willingness to stand up to corruption, your commitment to real justice. That's exactly the kind of leadership this community needs as it grows." Ruth shifted Samuel to her other arm. "Have you ever considered running for territorial representative?" Clayton blinked in surprise. "I'm a sheriff, Ruth. I enforce laws, I don't make them." Thomas made laws, in a way. He helped communities write agreements, establish fair trading practices, create systems that worked for everyone involved. Ruth smiled. "This territory is going to become a state someday, Clayton. When that happens, it's going to need representatives who understand the difference between serving powerful interests and serving people. I wouldn't even know where to start with something like that. You'd start by continuing to do exactly what you've been doing, listening to people, investigating thoroughly, and standing up for what's right even when it's difficult." Ruth looked toward the courthouse where Judge Morrison was still working. "And you'd have the support of everyone who saw what happened here today." Clayton was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with ideas he'd never seriously considered. Finally, he looked back at Ruth. "If I were to consider something like that, would I have your support, your advice?" "Clayton Hargrove, you'd have my complete support and any assistance I could provide." Ruth's smile was warm and genuine. Thomas would be proud to see his little brother helping to build something lasting and good. As Ruth rode back toward her cabin with Samuel secure in her arms, she felt a peace she hadn't experienced since James's death. Her son was safe, her home was secure, and her work would continue. But more than that, she'd helped shape events that would benefit her entire community for years to come. Behind her, Clayton watched her go while considering possibilities he'd never imagined. The woman who'd saved his brother's life had now helped save his own, not from physical danger, but from the kind of moral compromise that slowly destroyed a man's soul. 3 months later, when territorial elections were held, Sheriff Clayton Hargrove would win election as representative by the largest margin in the territory's history. His first official act would be proposing legislation to protect single women's property rights and regulate land speculation schemes. But that night, as Ruth tucked Samuel into his hand-carved cradle and sang the Cherokee lullabies her mother had taught her, she was simply grateful for the quiet triumph of justice served and family preserved. Outside her window, the mountains stood silent and protective under a canopy of stars, and the future stretched ahead, filled with possibilities she was finally free to explore. The sheriff had taken her baby, but he'd forgotten her past. That past had taught him who she really was, and in learning that, he'd discovered who he was meant to become. Sometimes, Ruth reflected as she drifted off to sleep, the most important lessons came disguised as the worst tragedies. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those lessons transformed not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you.